Good morning, AP Macro teachers. Today I want to get started with the very first of our video lesson plans on supply and demand, which is Unit 2. The way that I tend to teach supply and demand is actually in a slightly different order than the textbook does. What I found over the past is that the way the textbook introduces it is you have demand by itself and all the determinants, supply by itself and all their determinants, and then in a couple of modules down the line, it attempts to put those things together. And one of the things that I found is that causes an unnecessary level of confusion amongst the students because it's really difficult to understand demand outside of the context of the entire model, and it's really difficult to understand supply outside of the context of the entire model. So what I've been doing as I taught it the last couple of years is basically spending a day introducing the entire model itself, all of its workings, like what we're looking for, what we're not looking for, so that the kids know what the end result of all of this is going to look like, and then I dive into teaching demand by itself and supply by itself. So if you're interested in seeing exactly how that very first intro to supply and demand lesson goes, that's basically what I'm going to be doing in this video, kind of covering the basics of it, keeping in mind this happens before the individual supply and demand lessons. So the first part of this lesson that we're going to cover is going to be kind of analyzing the model itself, trying to understand what exactly price and quantity are and why it is that we're going to spend a whole bunch of time looking for price and quantity. One of the things I will point out before I get into the specifics, though, is usually it ends up taking a little bit longer than I think it should to introduce this model, because I do run into kids every single year, even kids who are in some of the more advanced maths, that don't really have a strong grasp of exactly how models work, not just in economics, but at all. So you may want to take some extra time actually teaching them how models work. This is basically just quadrant one, including things like showing them what the x-axis is, showing them what the y-axis is, etc. These are things that a lot of times I'll skip, and then I'll wish I had gone over them later because I'll find out there's some number of kids who just don't have that strong of a background. So first thing we're going to talk about after you go into that stuff is going to be what are price and quantity, and why is this model dedicated to tracking down those two pieces of information. So price tends to be a relatively easy concept for the kids to grasp because they have a lot of experience with this. Generally, I'll tell them that price is basically the sticker price or the shelf price of a good or service. So this is essentially what you're going to see at the store and what you're going to be asked to pay if you're a consumer. Now, the important part about price, and this is going to come up and become important later on, is you want to stress to the kids that price is essentially two different things. It's giving them two different pieces of information. The first is that the price is going to tell you how much a buyer pays for a product, which the kids are already familiar with. But you need to stress that the second half of that, and something they have more difficulty with, is the concept that in addition to telling you how much the buyer is going to pay, price also tells you how much the seller is going to earn for their product. And this is going to be important later when we try to tell them that one person's spending becomes another person's income. So you want to broach the subject here. So price is two things. It's the amount the buyer pays and the amount the seller gets, and you want to go ahead and stress that. Moving on to quantity, I always tell the kids that the quantity is basically tells you the amount of a good or service that is being produced, which is shown on the supply curve, and the amount of a product of good or service that's being consumed, which is shown on the demand curve. It's just basically answering the essential question, how much? So next we want to have a discussion of what exactly demand and the demand curve are. Long story short, demand is the amount of a product that consumers are willing and able to purchase at all prices. So the demand curve itself is a continuum. It shows exactly how much of a product people are willing and able to purchase at every possible price point, from a price of zero, which is essentially free, to a price of theoretically infinity, or whatever the maximum price the last consumer would be willing to pay is. The demand curve is always going to be downward sloping because it shows an inverse relationship between price and quantity, which makes sense given that our consumers are going to be rational and it's going to be in their best interest to pay less for a product rather than paying more for it. This rationality is what's called the law of demand, which tells us that people are willing and able to purchase more of a product at lower prices than at higher prices, which is kind of a fancy economicsy way of saying that essentially consumers are cheap, and if you give them the opportunity to better themselves by purchasing a product they want at a lower price, they will take it, and they will not purchase that product at a higher price. This is the point where you really want to stress to students that demand is the entire curve. It's the entire continuum, and it shows you how much of a product people will buy at every possible price point. This is going to be important because in the next lesson, we're going to try and differentiate between the demand curve and points on the demand curve known as quantity demanded. This is a big place that students have difficulty with, so I want you to stress at this point, the demand curve is the entire line, it is a continuum, and it shows all combinations of price and quantity along the entire curve. Moving on to supply. The supply curve, much like the demand curve, is also a continuum, and it shows the amount of a product that producers are willing and able to make at all possible price points. Essentially, the supply curve is going to show a direct or a positive relationship between the price of a product and the quantity of that product producers are willing and able to produce. This is what's known as the law of supply. The law of supply tells us that producers are willing and able to make more of a product available to the market when prices are high than they are when prices are low. The students tend to have a little bit of difficulty with this because the students are really good at demand because they are a demander of a product, and they're the ones, they think like a demander, they think like a consumer, whereas they tend to have a little bit of difficulty putting the shoe on the other foot. So for this, you need to stress to the students that it's not about what they, as the consumer, want, but rather about what is good for the producer, the manufacturer, and the seller of that particular product. And I've noticed over the years my students have a lot of difficulty with that. So you may want to give them a couple of scenarios where they're forced to put themselves in the shoes of the producer rather than the consumer. It's going to take them a little bit out of their comfort zone. So long story short, producers, much like consumers, are rational, right? And to a producer, they want to make as much money as they possibly can in return for their efforts. And so the reason why supply is upward sloping and it has the complete opposite relationship between price and quantity than demand did is because all things equal, if a seller is able to sell their product at a higher price, that means they're earning higher profits. And it seems fairly obvious, but I always like to write it on the board, more money is better than less money, and the kids can certainly agree with that. Although it's not technically 100% correct, I think the easiest way for students to think about this is that the seller of a product is greedy, right? If McDonald's could sell the burger they currently sell for $1 for $5 instead, they would absolutely do that, not because they're bad people and not because they're out to screw over the consumer, but because it's rational for them to want to earn more money for their time and effort than to earn less money for their time and effort. And economics, we're going to presume that they're going to take the choice that gives them the greatest benefit without having any, understanding of whether that benefit is good or whether that particular action is good for the consumer. So I'd like to wrap the lesson up with basically a discussion that kind of pulls everything all together. So the big question here is, so what does all of that mean? At the end of the day, the supply and demand model is basically just a visual representation of essentially a negotiation that takes place between the producers who make a product and the consumers who buy that product. The reason this negotiation has to take place is because the producers and the consumers do not have aligned interest. Consumers want to get a product at the lowest possible price. Producers would like to sell a product for the highest possible price, and this happens because both parties are rational. Consumers are rational in wanting to pay less so that they can have greater benefit. Producers are rational in wanting to charge more because they want to get the highest reward possible for their efforts. And so the only way that a trade is going to take place in this marketplace is that the producers and the consumers can figure out some point that they can both live with, a point where the price is adequately low that the consumer feels like they're getting a good deal, but high enough above the cost of production that the producer is willing to produce that product and willing to make that product available to the marketplace. So essentially all we're seeing is a visual representation of a giant negotiation in the marketplace happening between all the producers of a product and all the consumers of a product. And the final end result of all of this is we're going to get to that intersection of supply and demand known as the equilibrium point. And that equilibrium point basically shows you the end result of that negotiation. Producers got some of what they wanted, consumers got some of what they wanted, and the end result, the place where the market price is actually going to be and the market quantity or what is going to show up, is essentially the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve known as equilibrium. You can introduce the concept of equilibrium here, but we're actually not going to get back to it for several more lessons. So if you wanted to leave it off to prevent from confusing the students, you could kind of leave that last part off as well, because we won't be back to it for a couple of days.